In 1960, the typical American home cost about 2 times the typical American income. Today, that ratio has climbed to over 5.5 times, the highest level ever recorded going back more than 50 years. That gap didn't appear naturally, though, and it isn't simply the market. A big part of the reason your grandparents could plausibly buy a home on one paycheck traces back to two specific, deliberate government decisions, one in 1934 and one in 1944, that together engineered exactly the kind of affordable, one-income starter home era that now gets talked about like a fairy tale. Here's why the history matters more than the nostalgia. The quote-unquote normal version of home ownership most people picture, a young family buying a modest house on a single income, wasn't actually the default condition of the American housing market for most of its history. It was a specific, engineered outcome of specific policy choices operating for a specific window of time. This isn't a video about what should be done about today's housing market. That's a genuinely contested policy debate this channel isn't going to referee. However, it's the real story of how the quote-unquote easy starter home era got built in the first place, who it was built for, and what the actual data shows about how that math has shifted for every generation since. For most of American history before the 1930s, getting a mortgage looked nothing like it does today. Loans typically ran 5 to 10 years, required a down payment of around 50%, and ended with a large quote-unquote balloon payment, the remaining balance due all at once. It was a financing structure built for the wealthy, not for a working family trying to buy a modest home. Unsurprisingly, home ownership was far from universal. By the depths of the Great Depression, only around 44% of American households owned their home at all. In 1934, as part of the response to the Depression, the federal government created the Federal Housing Administration. Its most consequential invention wasn't a loan itself, it was a new structure. For one, a low down payment, 30-year, self-amortizing mortgage where a fixed, predictable payment steadily paid down both the principal and interest over 3 full decades with no balloon payment waiting at the end. The FHA didn't lend money directly. It insured private lenders against the risk of default, which made banks far more willing to offer these new, longer, friendlier loan terms in the first place. And the effects didn't stop at FHA-backed loans specifically. By the early 1960s, only around a third of American homes actually carried an FHA-insured mortgage, but the terms the FHA had pioneered rippled outward, with private lenders increasingly offering similar 30-year structures to non-FHA borrowers too. 10 years after the FHA's invention, a second program arrived and stacked directly on top of it. On June 22, 1944, President Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill, into law. Among its provisions was a mortgage guarantee for returning veterans, allowing many to buy a home with no down payment at all, with the government backing a substantial share of the loan if the borrower were to default. The combined effect of these two programs, layered together, was dramatic. The national home ownership rate climbed from that 44% Depression-era low to roughly 62% by 1960. And more than half of the entire increase happened in just 5 years, between 1940 and 1945, even in the middle of a world war. The financing existed. What came next was the supply to match it. In 1946, builder William Levitt began mass-producing affordable single-family homes in Long Island, New York, in a development that came to be called Levittown, using economies of scale, standardized designs, and large tract construction to build genuinely affordable homes quickly, aimed squarely at veterans and their new families. The model spread nationwide. The share of Americans living in suburbs rose from about 19.5% in 1940 to over 30% by 1960. For a genuinely enormous number of families, the combination of a 30-year mortgage, a zero-down VA guarantee, and mass-produced affordable construction added up to something that, for a narrow historical window, actually worked roughly as advertised: a modest, stable home purchased on one income. Here's the detail that connects this history all the way to today. Every single generation since the 1960s has had its own version of quote-unquote, it's harder to buy a home now, for reasons that look almost nothing alike. By 1980, the price-to-income ratio had only crept up modestly, but mortgage rates hit a staggering 18.6% in October of 1981, as the Federal Reserve fought runaway inflation. A family in 1980 might have faced a monthly payment burden every bit as brutal as today's buyers, even though the sticker price relative to income looked comparatively tame on a chart. By contrast, today's buyers face historically low ratios of income spent on rent relative to earlier decades in some measures, but a price-to-income ratio that hit a record 5.6 times in 2022, the highest ever recorded. Different decade, different specific mechanism, same underlying squeeze on affordability. The quote-unquote easy starter home era wasn't the normal baseline the housing market naturally returns to. It was a specific, engineered outcome of two stacked government programs operating during a specific multi-decade window, distributed unevenly even at its peak, and not a permanent feature of how home ownership is supposed to work. The plain English lesson here isn't a verdict on today's housing market. That's a debate that involves genuinely contested causes and solution this video isn't equipped to settle. It is, however, a correction to the nostalgia itself. The version of home ownership everyone points back to as how it used to work wasn't the default setting of a free market quietly doing its thing. It was the product of two specific, deliberate interventions working together for a specific slice of American history. Now here's the part worth sitting with though. Instead of just looking at the discouraging half, every one of those earlier decades looked genuinely unworkable to the people living through it in real time too. An 18.6% mortgage rate in 1981 sounded just as impossible to a young couple then as a 5.6 times income ratio sounds today. And yet, generation after generation, people found real paths through. Sometimes using tools that didn't exist yet, sometimes waiting out of a specific window, sometimes simply understanding the mechanics well enough to make an informed decision instead of an anxious one. The rules keep changing. That's real and worth taking seriously rather than waving away. But the quote-unquote, the rules changed has actually never meant the game became unplayable for everyone who bothered to study the board. If this video made you want to actually understand your own real numbers instead of just feeling discouraged by a headline ratio, that's the single most useful thing you can take from this history. Not despair, but use. Knowing exactly where you stand and planning deliberately from there is the same tool every one of those earlier generations actually used, just under different rules. If you're working towards a home purchase, I like to use Empower's Personal Capital Tracker to see how my numbers line up personally. I've included a link below if you want to see why. As always, not financial advice, just financial history. We'll see you next time.